Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: The Doll with Red Eyes. The old shop was tucked away at the end of a narrow street, hidden by the shadows of the buildings that surrounded it. It looked like something out of another time, out of place, even in the bustling city where it was located. A faded sign hung above the door, its letters nearly unreadable due to years of exposure to the elements. Antiques and oddities, it said, though that didn't seem to fully capture the strange atmosphere that lingered in the air. Maggie had passed the shop countless times before but never felt the urge to go inside. There was something about it, something unsettling. The windows were always clouded with dust, the interior dim and filled with a strange silence that made her feel as though the place had been abandoned long ago. Yet, there was always a light on inside, flickering in the corner of her eye when she walked by at night. But today, something was different. As she walked past, she couldn't help but glance through the window, drawn by an unexplainable compulsion. There, in the center of the display, stood a doll. It was an old-fashioned porcelain doll, with delicate, chipped features, her long, dark hair tangled and matted. Her white dress was stained with what looked like rust-colored smudges, and the faint scent of something sweet, almost sickly, hung in the air around it. It was the eyes. Maggie couldn't shake the eyes. They were large and unnervingly red, like two tiny rubies embedded in the doll's face. They gleamed in the dim light of the shop, and for a moment, Maggie thought they were following her, watching her every movement. Without thinking, she pushed open the door. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered, the sound echoing in the quiet shop. The air inside was thick with dust, and the shelves were cluttered with all manner of strange items, vintage books, tarnished jewelry, faded paintings, and odd trinkets that seemed out of place. It smelled old, musty, like the forgotten corners of the world. Behind the counter, an elderly man looked up from a book he was reading. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp but distant, as though he had seen things that others could not even imagine. He gave her a small, knowing smile, as though he had been expecting her. "You're here for her, aren't you?" His voice was raspy, like he had spoken very little in recent years. Maggie froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "The doll," the man said, nodding toward the back of the shop, where the porcelain figure sat on a dusty pedestal. "She's been waiting for someone like you." Maggie's throat went dry. She had never mentioned the doll to anyone, not even to herself. She had simply been drawn to it. But something in the man's voice sent a chill down her spine. There was no mistaking the certainty in his words. The doll was waiting for her. I don't understand," Maggie said, though she couldn't take her eyes off the doll. The man's smile faded, replaced by something darker, more somber. "It's not just a doll. It's much more than that. People have come and gone, but none of them ever leave with her." Maggie felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "What do you mean? What happened to them?" The old man didn't answer. He simply gestured for her to come closer. "If you wish to know, then you must see for yourself." Despite the warning bells ringing in her head, Maggie found herself walking toward the doll. As she drew closer, her pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She could see the fine cracks in the porcelain, the strange, almost unnatural gleam of its red eyes, and the faint, unsettling scent of roses that clung to it. Something shifted in the air, as though the entire room was holding its breath. For a moment, Maggie thought she saw the doll's eyes move, just the slightest shift in their gaze, but when she blinked, they were still, unblinking, staring. The old man's voice broke through her thoughts. "She comes to life at night," he said quietly. "But only for those she chooses." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, her curiosity outweighing the rising fear. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes darkened. "You have the same look as the others, eyes full of questions, full of fear. She feeds on it. She thrives on it." A cold wave washed over Maggie, but before she could respond, the man spoke again. "Take her. If you dare." Maggie looked back at the doll. Its eyes were still fixed on her, and this time, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. She felt like she was suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in around her. And yet, something inside her urged her to reach out, to take the doll into her hands. With trembling fingers, she did. The instant she touched the porcelain skin, a shock of cold ran through her, freezing her to the bone. The doll seemed to come alive in her hands, its limbs stiffening, its body growing heavier as though it had suddenly gained weight. And then she heard it. A voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder, more distinct. "You shouldn't have touched me." Maggie stumbled back, the doll slipping from her hands and crashing to the floor. She gasped, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she looked down, the doll was no longer on the floor. It was back on the pedestal, sitting upright, its red eyes glowing brighter than before. "Do you understand now?" the man asked, his voice no longer raspy but cold, like ice. "She does not belong to you. She belongs to the darkness." Before Maggie could respond, the air in the shop grew heavier. The room seemed to spin, the walls warping and bending around her. The light from the shop's dim bulbs flickered and flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, growing taller, reaching for her, as though they had minds of their own. Maggie's breathing grew erratic. Her vision blurred, and a voice, distorted and hollow, began to speak to her. "You belong to me now, forever." The doll's red eyes glowed brighter still, and suddenly, Maggie could no longer see. The world around her turned black. Maggie's heart raced, her breath shallow and erratic as the darkness swallowed her whole. The room, once dimly lit by the flickering overhead lights, was now utterly pitch black. There were no sounds, no creaks of the old wooden floorboards beneath her feet, no breath to be heard, not even the beat of her own pulse. The silence was suffocating, unnatural. It was as if the very air had been stolen away. And then, a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. They came from somewhere behind her, soft at first, like the shuffle of a figure moving through thick carpet, but then they grew louder, each footstep heavy with purpose. "You can't hide from me." The voice was calm, chillingly calm. It wasn't the man behind the counter anymore, nor was it Maggie's own thoughts. This voice was something else, ancient, cold, and filled with an eerie power that vibrated through her very bones. The footsteps continued, moving closer with each passing second. Maggie tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. She was rooted to the spot, her body trembling uncontrollably, as if the air itself had become thick with dread, holding her in place. "You touched me," the voice continued, growing louder, more demanding. "You made your choice, Maggie. You belong to me now." A chill crawled up her spine, and her skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. But she couldn't see. It was as if the very darkness had enveloped her vision, swallowing any light that might have given her hope. Every part of her screamed for escape, but the terror paralyzed her. Her legs refused to move, her arms stiff at her sides. She heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across the floor. She could feel the presence drawing closer, the air growing colder and colder. It felt as though something was crawling up her back, a cold, invisible hand brushing against her skin. And then she felt it. A hand, small, cold, and delicate, reached out from behind her, tapping her shoulder. Maggie's body jerked in shock, but no scream came from her lips. Her throat was frozen. She slowly turned, her eyes wide with terror, desperate to see the source of the touch. In front of her, where there had once been only darkness, a figure materialized. It was the doll. But it was no longer just a porcelain figure on a shelf. It stood before her, towering over her, its small frame impossibly stretched, its eyes glowing bright red, like two embers in the night. The doll's once delicate features were now contorted with a twisted, monstrous expression. Its porcelain skin cracked, and from the cracks, black tendrils of smoke curled out, wrapping around the figure's body like living vines. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. The doll's eyes blinked, and Maggie felt her chest tighten. "I've waited for so long." The voice was not just a whisper now. It was a chorus of many voices, layered together, deep and echoing in the depths of her mind. "For someone like you, someone full of fear and desire. Someone willing to belong." The doll's head tilted to the side, and its eyes, those red eyes, seemed to bore into Maggie's soul. She could feel its gaze inside her, prying into every dark corner of her mind. Her thoughts, her deepest fears, everything was laid bare before the doll. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The doll had her trapped. With a sudden, jerky movement, the doll lifted its tiny hand and touched Maggie's forehead. A jolt of icy coldness shot through her like lightning, seizing her body, numbing her thoughts. "You will never leave," the voice whispered again. "Not now. Not ever." In that moment, the room around her began to shift. The walls closed in, the shelves bending and warping as though they were alive, and the floor beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a deep, bottomless void. From the depths of that darkness, Maggie could hear whispers, hundreds, thousands, maybe more, each one calling her name, each one beckoning her into the abyss. And then the ground gave way beneath her. She fell, her body tumbling into the dark, endless void. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. She was falling faster and faster, the shadows around her becoming thicker, heavier, until she couldn't breathe. The whispers grew louder, until they became a deafening roar. "You belong to me now, Maggie," the voice repeated, over and over, echoing in her ears. "You are mine. Forever." She reached out desperately, trying to grab onto something, anything, to stop her fall, but her fingers grasped only emptiness. The darkness swallowed her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Maggie lay still in the void, unable to move, unable to think. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and yet she felt nothing. Not fear, not cold, not even the weight of her own body. It was as though she had become part of the darkness itself. She had no shape, no form. She was a thought, a whisper in the void, drifting aimlessly. But then, a light appeared, a single flickering flame in the distance. It was small, fragile, and yet it beckoned to her. Her body reacted instinctively. She had to reach it. It was her only chance. With great effort, she pushed herself toward the light, her body moving slowly, as if it were not her own. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing its true form. It was the doll, standing alone in the middle of the void, its red eyes glowing once more. "You think you can escape?" The doll's voice hissed, its tone dark and malicious. "There is no escape. You belong to me, Maggie. You always have." And then, as Maggie reached out, her hand inches from the doll's, the light flared brightly, blindingly. And everything went black. Maggie awoke to a darkness so thick, so suffocating, that it felt as though the air itself was pressing down on her chest, forcing the breath from her lungs. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears, and for a moment, she wondered if she had died, if this endless, crushing void was the afterlife. But no, she could still feel her body. Her limbs tingled with the sensation of being alive, of existing in some strange, distorted way. She opened her eyes, or at least she thought she did, but there was nothing to see. No light, no shapes, no shadows. Only the feeling of being completely surrounded by nothingness. Then, from deep within the dark, a familiar sound reached her ears, a soft, slow scraping noise, like porcelain scraping against wood. Maggie, her name, whispered in that same eerie, guttural voice, chilled her to the bone. The voice was no longer a chorus of whispers. It was clearer, more defined, and yet it still carried that same weight of ancient power. Maggie tried to move, but her body felt wrong. Her limbs were heavy, stiff, like they no longer belonged to her. She could hear her heartbeat quicken, the rush of blood in her veins like a constant drum, but every movement felt sluggish, unnatural. "You thought you could escape." The voice was almost mocking now, cruel. "You belong to me, Maggie, and I will not let you go." The scraping sound grew louder, and Maggie could feel a presence approaching. It wasn't just the voice, it was something else, something darker, something malevolent. She could almost sense it moving closer, the air growing colder, more oppressive. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, as though it were feeding on her fear. And then, as though the darkness itself parted, a sliver of light appeared, cutting through the suffocating void. It was small at first, just a flicker in the distance, but it grew larger, brighter, until Maggie could see the source of the light, the doll. The porcelain figure stood in the center of the darkness, its red eyes gleaming with an unnatural light, like twin rubies glowing in the night. Its tiny hands were outstretched, beckoning her forward, its smile twisted into something far more sinister than any doll should have. Maggie's body trembled as she stared at the doll. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, to run, but her feet refused to move. It was as though the darkness had a hold on her, a grip that tightened with every passing second. "Come closer," the voice purred, now much clearer, much more intimate, as if the doll were speaking directly into her mind. "I've waited so long for you, Maggie. You are the perfect one. The one who will never leave." The ground beneath her feet shifted, and suddenly Maggie found herself stumbling forward, her body moving as though it were not her own. Her legs carried her without her permission, drawing her closer to the doll with each agonizing step. She could feel her pulse quicken, the fear surging within her, but it wasn't enough to stop her from moving. And then, just as her hand reached out to touch the doll, the room shook violently. The very air around her seemed to tremble, and the darkness itself seemed to scream in fury. The doll's eyes flickered, the red light becoming blinding, until Maggie was forced to shut her eyes against the intensity. "You think you can control me?" the voice howled, now full of rage. "You are nothing but a puppet, Maggie. A toy in my game." The doll's form began to distort, its body elongating, twisting, until it was no longer a porcelain figure at all. It became something far more horrifying, something that defied logic, something that looked as though it had been stitched together from nightmares. Its limbs were too long, too twisted, and its head was far too large for its body. Its eyes, once red and gleaming, were now black, endless voids that swallowed all light. Maggie felt her body freeze, her heart racing in her chest as the doll's new form loomed over her, its presence suffocating. It towered above her, its jagged, distorted face twisted in a grotesque grin that sent waves of nausea through her. "You are mine," the voice whispered, its tone low and dangerous. "And you will remain mine forever." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A deep, dark chasm yawned wide, pulling at her, threatening to swallow her whole. Maggie screamed, but no sound escaped her throat. She reached out, desperate to hold onto something, anything, but her hands found only emptiness. And then, just as she thought she would be dragged into the abyss, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, her vision swimming, and for a brief moment she thought she saw someone, standing in the distance. A figure, cloaked in shadow, watching her, waiting. The pain grew worse, a searing heat spreading through her chest, like her very soul was being torn apart. She looked down, and there, in the place of her heart, was a small, dark mark. A symbol, carved into her skin, glowing faintly. The figure in the distance stepped closer, and Maggie's breath hitched. It was the old man from the shop. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was holding something in his hands, something small, wrapped in cloth. "Maggie," he said, his voice strained, panicked. "You have to fight it. You have to fight the doll." But Maggie couldn't move. She could barely even think. The doll's presence was suffocating, its power pressing down on her from all sides. "You think you can save her?" The voice of the doll laughed, the sound like nails scraping across a chalkboard. "You cannot save her. No one can." The old man reached out, his trembling hands holding the cloth closer to Maggie's chest. "It's the only way," he whispered, though his voice was thick with doubt. "You have to destroy it. You have to destroy the doll." But before Maggie could respond, the world around her began to fade. The doll's red eyes flashed brighter, filling the void with an overwhelming, blinding light. "No," the voice of the doll echoed, now distant, fading into the darkness. "You belong to me. Forever." And then everything went black. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.